Welcome to Authored by Us, a podcast celebrating children's books about characters of color or of different cultural experiences, and the authors who bring these diverse works to life. Each week, we invite you to join us as we turn the pages of these bookshelf gems and hear from their creators who understand that stories of diverse experience truly come to life when authored by us. Here's your host, Zenzi Hodge.
Greetings and welcome back, listeners. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Authored by Us. Each episode, we feature authors and the books they write. Well, this week, we decided to do things differently. While many books contain stories, not all stories are found in books. So this week, we are featuring storytellers, the stories they tell, and the stories sometimes behind those stories. Now, while I grew up with books all around me and reading, I also grew up listening to storytellers in my local community, regaling in tales that taught us culture and tradition. And they often told these stories with humor and music. Well, one of these storytellers is this episode's guest, Kwabena Davis. Kwabena is a native of St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands, and is an educator, musician, and advocate for cultural education, with a special focus on preserving Virgin Islands culture and passing it on to the next generation. Welcome to the show, Kwabena.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, I've interviewed guests that I've either just met or some people that I've known for several years. But Kwabena I've known for a very long time. In fact, he's known me before I even knew myself. So it is an honor for me to have you here on this show. You represent not just Virgin Islands history and culture. For me, you represent my parents, my grandparents, my village. And so it is such an honor to have you here with us today.
Thanks. I couldn't be more honored myself.
Now, growing up in the Virgin Islands and being a parent here as well, I've heard two things. I've heard a child say, read to me, and I've also heard, tell me a story. And to me, they have two distinct definitions. And even while you and I were talking initially, we talked about not reading stories, but telling stories. So can you tell our listeners, what is the difference between reading a story versus telling a story?
Well, for many of us, when you're reading the story, you generally say only what is there. And with telling the story, you have an opportunity to become creative. While you can be creative while you are reading, you have far more latitude when you are doing the actual reciting / telling of the story. Because what we have found is that even when, for instance, if you're reading it, it's very difficult to grab the guitar and sing, and you have to use so much more of your voice when you are reading. Well, vocal flexibility is important whether you're reading or telling, but when you are reading, you really have to put a whole lot more into into your vocal expression. And with that, with the actual telling, you have an opportunity for a lot of body language and things like that. But now, of course, with the current situation that we are in, where we can't do it under other circumstances, it's very difficult to put in a lot of the histrionics, a lot of the body language, the using up of a stage, whether it's a classroom or in a concert hall, as an extreme. So you find that with reading, you do have some limitations, but with the actual telling, you have a whole lot more latitude. And then let's face it, when you are telling a story, based on the type of story it is, you may not need much light, you see? But with reading, of course,
So it sounds like telling a story is more of a performance as opposed to
Precisely.
reading is more of recitation. Hmm, okay.
So true.
Okay. So where does this
So true.
tradition of storytelling come from?
Well, in any society, on any continent, you will find that the people have a storytelling tradition. So it is, because even here in the Virgin Islands, we have made some adaptations where we have gotten stories from a wide variety of places. Now, a lot of our stories um, do come from our African ancestral past and from our European ancestral past as well, because being, a plural society that we are not melting pot like people, like to believe. But I mean, with the exception, of course, if you speak of the French people,
Mhm.
the Puerto Ricans, they are a part of Virgin Islands melting pot because they came and they become a part of, because as a matter of fact, which brings to mind when Dr. Lesmo Emmanuel was active, and here with us, several of the stories and the characters in the Anansi stories, for instance, he said that he got the names of some of the characters from the French people. See? So I hope that answered some.
It answered and it took us into a couple of other things. So the first thing I want to ask you about, because you mentioned the connection to other continents, the continent being Africa and to Europe, and bringing up the ancestral piece of it. But I want to ask about two things. One, during enslavement of our ancestors, they lost their names. Attempts were made to take away our identity and our humanity, but through all of that there was a tradition of storytelling that prevailed. Why do you think that with the
Yes.
other things that were lost, why do you think storytelling continued as a part of the African tradition?
Well, you see, I like the music. A lot of storytelling was done under um, not in a negative sense, but shady circumstances. Because you didn't want the slave masters and them to know a lot of what you were doing. And the wonderful thing about the storytelling tradition, it not only provided guidance, they not only shared information, but it gave them an opportunity to share messages of hope, in terms of getting out of the condition that they were um, in terms of they recognizing that there has to be something better than the horrible situation that they were in. And it further offered methods and techniques of getting out of the condition that they were in. Now, there are people who feel that a lot of the stories were just for entertainment. But as previously mentioned, there were roles that these stories played. Because to give someone hope, that is quite a role. To provide even educational opportunities, that was quite a role. Um, Ways of guiding people, modifying their behavior and things like that. Those were very significant roles for their survival. So storytelling um, did have quite a bit of roles in that regard.
And you mentioned Anansi stories. And so I knew growing up, we heard Anansi stories. And it wasn't until I went to college and I heard somebody talking about Anansi stories. And I'm like, well, you're not from the Virgin Islands or you're not from the Caribbean. And I didn't realize that these were stories that were heard other places. And so there's some stories that
Yes.
prevail throughout the diaspora. So like the Anansi stories,
Mhm.
how is it that there's been this connection across the oceans and the continents? with these particular stories or with certain characters?
Yeah, well, one of the things is that the the Anansi stories come from a people of Ghana. In general, they are called the Akan peoples. And among the Akan peoples, the most dominant, I think, is the Ashanti. And you will find the name Anansi being used in many, many places. In the Virgin Islands, it was Brunansi. You see, the first syllable was cut off. You see? And but and then as the decades went along and as research was done and people picked up the name Anansi, that became the prevailing name. Now our folks, like, not in the Virgin Islands and throughout the Caribbean, throughout the Americas, when they brought people from West Africa, they brought mixed peoples and they were placed in different locations. And the Akan people were pretty dominant uh, people that were brought in that in terms of numbers, because several of the biggest slave trading stations were right there in Ghana.
Mm-hmm.
You see? So you had Fort Christianborg, you had Fort Frederickborg, and of course, what does that bring to mind?
Fort Christian, yes, in
That's right,
St. Thomas.
Christiansted,
That's right.
Frederickstead.
Christiansted. Yep,
You see?
absolutely.
So many of them, and this is where they brought them. And of course, you had places here in the islands where they were not just the captives were not just sold here, you see, to be used here,
Mm-hmm.
but they were sold here to be taken on other vessels to go elsewhere, just like in other jurisdictions. They were taken there, and some were brought here, but they were taken to other jurisdictions. And that is where you would find that the stories of the Akan, the Anansi in particular, would be able to be spread so easily. And they use their folk character, the white name. Now in the States, for instance, that name um, was not used until in more recent years. You had the Uncle Remus stories where Brer Rabbit performed the same things as Brunansi. But you will find a lot of these stories are identical to what we know as Brunansi stories. You go to Puerto Rico, you have the Wang Bobo,
Wow.
you see, and again, they are out of, again, you will find that some of them are of the very close, very similar to the Anansi stories and things, because throughout West Africa, um, you had interactions among people, and as such, that's how the culture became shared and spread, and the same thing happened with us as they brought them to this hemisphere.
and and from West Africa to the Virgin Islands. We
Yes,
visited
West
Ghana.
Africa, correct.
Correct. We visited Ghana during the year of return, and I told my son, I said there was at least one person who left here who walked on the sands in Africa, that walked on the sands in St. Thomas. They had, over the years of the transatlantic slave trade, I said, as many of our ancestors that were taken, I said, there's at least one person from that touched where you are here, touched where you walk on St. Thomas. And obviously they brought their culture, they brought their stories with them. And I think that's a part of how this has happened to continue, how our stories have
That's right.
continued from one continent to the next, across the seas. And like you said, if I wasn't even aware of the stories in Puerto Rico that you started to mention, but how it moves through places, moves through people, and even into different languages.
Yes, yes.
So something I also noticed, since I mentioned my son. I knew growing up here that we would hear stories. I heard lots of people telling stories. I've heard you telling stories. The one thing I didn't
Mm.
expect was that while my son was here, that he would enjoy the same storytelling traditions as I did as a kid. And so
Ah,
he actually had a chance to hear a local storyteller sharing a story several years ago, and he and his friends, they still talk about it because it had an impact on them. But how did
right.
storytelling really become a part of our culture here in the US Virgin Islands? And then who were some of the storyteller culture bearers?
Yeah, well, again, how it started, you go right back to the plantation days. And you would find the African people um just like in evenings, whether under a tamon tree or what we know as the as a guinea tamon or the baobab, a guinea bread, excuse me, or the baobab, and or some nice setting where everyone could be hearing something to provide a bit of amusement, uh, to pass time when they had, nice lengthy breaks. And then sometimes you would hear something like this, and you know that they're about to tell some stories, and it would be a call and response kind of thing. Cheering, 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 cheering. And it's evening time, and they would respond, daylight gone. And let's use my name, Pepe Kwab. And they tell her, Tim, Tim, Papa Bell come. Tim, Tim, Papa Bell come. Tim, Tim, Papa Bell come. Tell me a story about long time. Donkey chew tobacco and he spit white lime. Tell me a story about long time. Donkey chew tobacco and he spit white lime. And you had that call and response throughout, from place to place. And that's when story time coming up. Got the children who there, they know the proper response in between. And then they start to sing, tell me a story about long time. And that would go on. And as more children come, they join in until it become like a choir of singers. Adults came into, because it was not only a group thing, but sometimes in their home to
Yeah.
pass time, they would be telling the stories and things like that. And that's how I got involved, you
Mhm.
know. But I think you had another part to the question,
Well,
but I
who
don't.
are some of the storytelling culture bearers that either introduced you to storytelling or kept the tradition going?
Oh, well, his name was Charles Douglas. He was married to my aunt Camilla Davis, and everybody called him Pepe Charlie. He They lived in Pallyburg. I went to Pallyburg when I was about 8 or 9 years old to live. And in the afternoons, like after school, I go up to visit him and my aunt. He would pull me. I say, "Come, let me tell you a story." And he would tell me these stories. And then nighttime, I would go out under the almond tree, and the guys would, my contemporaries and those younger than me, would come around the tree, and I would tell them the story Pippi Charlie tell me. And that's how my repertoire of stories, emerged. And it was from people like him is who are telling the stories. And I didn't hear about Hector Roebuck here from here, his son Elmo D a little later on. I didn't hear about Delta Dorsch and later people like Eulalie Rivera until Dr. Lesmore Emmanuel had pretty much introduced the cultural renaissance in the in about 1970, and it was then I just continued building on my stories. And Dr. Emmanuel's wife Phyllis, she know a lot of stories from Grenada,
Mhm.
and she introduced us to those stories. And a lot of those stories are incorporated in the collection that Doc did. I mean, that
Yeah.
was our term of endearment for him, Doc. And long before them
Mhm.
were people like Sister Curtis, um, Martha Cache
Mhm.
of Holland, Martha Holland fame.
Wow.
And that goes back to 1916 of the hurricane. You would hear somebody say, "Man, how you doing?" They say, "Man, I'm holding on like Martha in his arms." It came from her. You see, meaning thing really tough. And
But you're
but they
still
were
holding
big
on.
names
Yeah.
on St. Thomas, in terms of storytellers way back at the turn of the century and things like that. Because they particularly Sister Curtis, who would even though she was an entrepreneur, she was a market lady, eventually a shopkeeper and barkeeper and all of that. But they said sometimes when they see her donkey coming on a moonlight night in Savannah, they know she's going somewhere to sit down to tell some stories. So people would just follow along and go there to hear the stories. But that would have been much before my time. But those are two of the names. And I really, you raise a very good point there for me, because I know that there had to be great storytellers on St. John. And now you have put me to work, because I need to find out the names of some storytellers on St. John, because this isn't going to be the only time this is going to come up.
Come on.
So I need to be prepared.
So you didn't think I was going to give you a homework assignment, but I did, huh?
You certainly did. Uh,
When you mentioned Dr. Lesmore Emmanuel, and so when I started at the beginning, I talked about you being a part of my village and my
mhm.
godparents, and Dr. Lesmore Emmanuel and Dr. Phyllis Emmanuel are my godparents, and so we were introduced to books and to stories, and I remember hearing books and stories in their house, and
Yes.
I think to come to a point where I have written a book, I think probably started back in their house when Dr. Emmanuel wrote Puppy Shung's Last Wedding. And I have
Yeah,
a
yeah,
part of
yeah.
an episode where I talk about that being the book that inspired me. Because when I was a
Ah,
kid, I never knew anyone who wrote a book. You saw books on the bookshelf, but you didn't
ah,
expect to see your godfather's name on a book, or I saw my father's name on a book. And it really gave me some inspiration. I have heard
oh,
him
yeah.
telling stories with either you playing the guitar, with my father on the conga drums. And so it
That's right.
became the things you're talking about, how different people read their stories and what they brought to it. That's something I got to experience as a child. But one of the things I realized with Dr. Emmanuel was that the way he told stories, he just brought them to life. And whether he was reading a story that he wrote, or he had now put on the performance of telling the story that he wrote, it sounded like two completely different works of art. And so
Mhm.
I realized that there's an
Yes.
art. To me, I think there's an art to storytelling. So, what do
Of
you
course.
find to be the art of storytelling?
You see, when you consider the art, you have to think one performance. And as such, you have to consider the first of all your diction. You must consider your vocal flexibility, because if it's a nervous little girl speaking, you can't say, Oh, I am so scared, says the girl. You have to take on a nice high light voice with some tremolo in it that gives the character of the, I am so scared. You have to, so this is what I'm speaking about in terms of like vocal
Yeah.
flexibility. You must be able to consider the audience you are telling the story to. Because if you're telling stories to a group ages 3 to 7, you tell it differently from children, let's say 8 to 14 or 15. And you tell it differently to those older than that up to adulthood. It's a different way of saying it. And that's where, to a high degree, the art comes in. Your eye contact with your audience, the props that you need to put in place to make sure that you're effective, the the ability to make it believable is those are all to me components that make up the art of storytelling.
We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back with Kwabena Davis.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. Authored by Us is made possible by listeners like you. We thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
So we're back with Kwabena Davis and we're talking about the art of storytelling.
Mhm.
Now, Kwabena, what role do you see storytelling play in the preservation of our culture, particularly now that we're in a digital age?
Well, for me, to explain that, I guess some may say, well, he's a bit old fashioned, that's why. But the person to person is what we're lacking. The digital age is no longer a convenience, it is a necessity. However, it is it is producing so much individualism and an unhealthy individualism. People are so much into themselves and their own personal gratification through being by themselves and with themselves that it is kind of killing us. The value of the person to person storytelling does more to help to preserve the culture because it gives us that human interaction. It helps to rebuild and mend that need for us to be in more personal contact. Because I just want to add something. I remember I love your book. With that, I always just think of, a Christmas without snow. It is, I mean, what you do with that book is something that a lot of our young people, when I'm reading it to them, they feel a part of. You can almost see them like snuggling to each other, you know, and because you kind of sort of help them to feel a chill, and then you can help them to feel a warmth between themselves.
Oh,
But I'm
yeah.
saying all that to say is, if I, when I'm reading it to children, I can see all of that, but I can't see it when I'm just doing it digitally. And for a
Mm.
lot of us as storytellers, it's a struggle, but we do get through it and get through it very well. Being able to tell it without having an audience. But that people to people thing is so very important. But with the preserving our way of life, um, it its role is significant, and we have to continue to do it using the digital concept,
Mhm.
and try to use it as an opportunity where people are rewarded even financially. Now, some people are upset with me because when I go to tell stories now, one requirement is simple. I will come as long as I can bring an apprentice and you give the apprentice an honorarium. Because if you don't do that, I generally decline from coming. Now, if the
Mhm.
apprentice cannot come, I will do it, you know. And sometimes, from the goodness of my heart, I will share a bit of the honorarium with with one of my apprentices, you know. But it is very important, I think, that we use both media
Mhm.
to continue this art, but reward the young people beyond a rung of applause and a certificate that really doesn't carry. They can't take to Pueblo.
They can't. Yep. The certificate is not taken as tender at the grocery store. I
Thank
agree.
you very much.
Yeah. So let me just say this first, because I'm still blushing that you mentioned my book and that you read it to children. But in my book, at towards the end, because I celebrate so much about our Virgin Islands culture in the book
Yes,
and
yes,
Christmas, our Virgin Islands Christmas culture,
yes,
a key part of our Christmas culture is Voices of Love, which is
yes,
your group that my mother
yeah,
has sang with for
yeah,
couple of decades. But
yeah,
you are featured in the book. And so there is a
yes,
character there with a
yes,
guitar. And
yes,
so there are
yes,
a few characters in my book
oh,
inspired by people. One is inspired by my son, the other by the police officer by my husband. The sweetbread baker is my grandmother, but the
yeah,
gentleman with the guitar, Kwabena, is you. So
yes.
so just to know that you read
No
this
wonder I
story
like the
to
book
other
so much.
children makes me so happy. Oh man, it's wonderful.
Uh,
And yes, you with your guitar is a staple for me when it comes to thinking about holidays in the Virgin Islands, and even just in telling stories, just like how you brought your guitar out earlier, and
oh yeah.
you called the listeners to be prepared for the story, and
Mm,
you are a musician. We've we've had another author on the show who is a musician, and we talked about the role that music plays in reading and engaging children with books. And we also see evidence of stories being told through musical genre. Stories are
that's
told
right.
through rap, and it's told through calypso. And so, what role do you see music playing in education and literacy? And how do you think that we can use music in reading and using music in storytelling?
Well, it's a key component because one of the opportunities you have with using music is that you want to put a song in there that reinforces the message of the story. Because, and the reason I put it like that is, I mean, while there's a variety of storytelling forms, the one that I generally work with is called the gnomic, where there is a message of guidance or advice or something. GNOMIC. And that style is what most of us, when we're doing storytelling, use. And the music, again, it is used to help reinforce the message that the teller is trying to get across. And just a quick example of that. There's a story of some children who had went to who told a lie and they end up in the Hanjumbi house. And they were able to get out of the Hanjumbi house by singing this song that the Jumbi hated.
Yes.
And the Jumbi hated this song. I said something that wasn't true. I said something that wasn't true. I said something that wasn't true. Now I'm sorry for what I do. Now I'm sorry for what I do. So The message is very clear. Always do what?
Tell the
Tell.
truth.
That's right.
Sure. Now, you told us about being inspired by your uncle, but what was the story that inspired you most as a young person?
Well, the well, it's really a more that I like the story because it was very unique. And this story had to do with again Bruno and C. And in this instance, he wanted to win this girl's affections and attention. And the only way he would have had to do this was outdoing some other guys who had failed when they were chopping out some bush with catch and keep and sting and nettle and man, better man and all them thing what us choke and scratch and itch was he was not supposed to scratch. But he came up with a special way of getting away with it without them catching on. So, and I don't know what the name of the story was, but it had to do with Brunancy and the, what would they call it? The Chucky Ichi bush them. You see? So he was the only one that was able to chop out the bush without scratching. And he was able to get the pretty rich girl to marry in the end. Where they end up with 42 children and they live happily ever after.
42 children?
Don't ask me how, but that's Brunancy.
Listeners, we're going to take a quick break. And when we return, Kwabena is going to pull out his storytelling to give you a treat before the episode ends. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Authored by Us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review so you never miss an episode. Now back to the show with your host, Zenzi Hodge.
So we're back with Kwabena Davis. I hope that you are settled in and ready for the telling of this story. Kwabena is going to tell us the story of Mr. Lena Man and the Jumbida.
A long time ago, way back when fowl had teeth, it had a cheap, good for nothing man named Mr. Lena Man. Any time he have to pay for something, he want to pay next to nothing. Well, it so happened one day he want to buy a piece of land. Everybody he go to it too expensive. They cut off half dying enough. They cut off another half of the half dying enough. Well, one day a man walk up to him. This gray, funny looking man had a piece of property and he tell Mr. Lena Man about it, how big it was. And all he have to do is give him something like $19. Well, Mr. Lena Man, he fly off the handle. That kind of money just for a little piece of land. He said, but I'm giving you a nice big piece of land. Well, the man take him to see the land. If you walk to the head of the paved street, it have a crossroad. And when you walk up straight ahead, past the crossroad, the land, I think it's still up there. But you see, it was part cemetery or part burial ground. And Mr. Lena Man didn't know. When he gave the man the $19, when you look, the man tell him, well, thank you. Again. Well, Mr. Lena man was so excited. He looked at the land, man. He went, there was some weed by his foot. He grabbed the weed, pull it out. Next thing he heard, who that is picking weed up from the land? He looked around, he ain't seen nobody. He said, tis I, Mr. Lena man. Next thing he heard, big and little, get up and help Mr. Lena man pick the bush. There must be no bush left here today. There must be no bush left here today. Big hand, small hand, maga hand, crookedy hand, mangy hand, all kind of hand. Push up out the ground. They weed up the whole place. Man, Mr. Lena, man got on a big smile because he didn't expect this. Well, he decided, well, he gonna get something out of this. Mr. Lena man had a bag of corn home. He gone home. He bring the corn up to the land where it start to get dark. So he wait till next morning, carry the corn and the land, dig the first hole and throw in the corn and cover it up. He waiting, he dig a next hole, throw it in the hole, cover it up. He waiting, dig a next hole, throw it in the ground, cover it up. Then he, who that is out there planting corn? He got more confidence now. Tis I, Mr. Lena man. Next thing you hear, big and little, get up and help Mr. Lena man. Plant the corn. There must be no corn left out today. There must be no corn left out today. Well, with that, big hand, small hand, fat hand, maga hand, crooked hand, mangy hand, all kind of hand, come up out the ground. They plant out the whole area of corn. Well, he had no problem watering the area, but it just so happened, man, the corn them grew up real big and beautiful. And Mr. Lena, man, no, when he put out his hand, we pull it back. No, no, no. If I pick one, them thing gonna come out of the ground and go with all my corn. Gone home. Call his wife. I want you to go up by the land. Now he explained to her in detail. When you go up there, he have some lovely corn that they don't grow. They're ready to pick. Don't touch them. I'm going to get the village. Go there and stand up. Don't let nobody go near the land. Don't touch them. He gonna get the whole community of people to come help him pick the corn. Well, his wife up there, man, she looking at how lovely the corn them look. It's so beautiful. And she walking around and they all look nice and fat. She said, if I pick one from right in the back here, he ain't gonna notice. So she decided, I'm gonna surprise him and I'm gonna cook some. By the time she went in, she break off one, she break off two, she break off three. Who is that picking the corn? So frightened, she battled. Sorry, Mrs. Lena, man. And next thing she heard, big and little, get up and help Mrs. Lena, man. Pick the corn. There must be no corn left here today. There must be no corn left here today. Big hand, small hand, fat hand, maga hand, crooked hand, mangy hand, all kind of hand, pop up out the ground. They pick all the can went down in the ground with it. Just then, Miss Alina, man, and the crowd of people reached the area, and he was in an uproar because his wife bawling, and she got these 4 cans in her hand. I didn't tell you, don't touch the can. Bust the woman one clout. Who is that out there hitting Mrs. Lena, man? Just I, Miss Alina, man. Oh. Next thing, hand over your mouth when you hear big and little. Get up and help Miss Alina, man. Beat your wife. There must be no wife left here today. There must be no wife left here today. Big hand, small hand, fat hand, maga hand, crooked hand, mangy hand, all kind of hand come out from under the ground. Beat the poor woman till you can't find her. And he said, oh, Jesus, oh, Gami. And he starts scratching his head. Who is that scratching his head? Oh. He trying not to answer. Who is that scratching his head? Well, when he tried to run something, grab his foot. See, figure, he could answer fast, and they got to lose him and he won't get away. But the funny thing, he was so far in the land, he wasn't thinking about, just I'm a Salina, man. When the Lucy foot, he take off running. Well, what you think? Big hand, small hand, fat hand, maga hand, crooked hand, mangy hand, all kind of hand come up out of the ground. Well, this scratch Mr. Lena man head till it reached down to his neck. We'll bend the story and now take a pen and write your name. Sometimes too much help is better than no help at all. And if you think a lie, when you reach the crossroad to the healthy paved street, or you go straight up the hill, Miss Helena man might come out asking you to please help him find his head. See, if you think a lie, you go up there after like 11 o'clock in the night. But you gotta go by yourself. You could even call his name. I'm sure he gonna answer you. But when he hold your hand, you gotta help him find his head. It takes some people 14 years, and eventually, I don't know how they get away, but they leave St. Thomas. So you go ahead, you try. Again.
Kwabena, thank you so much for the story.
This was an easy question.
And thank you so much. I have to stop laughing. So thank you so much for the story. And thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Authored by Us. This was definitely a departure from what we normally do, and it was a delight to have you bring this storytelling experience to us.
Oh, yes, man. This was certainly a pleasure.
So as we get ready to close this episode of Authored by Us, I would love to thank our guest today, Mr. Glenn Kwabena Davis, for sharing with us the art of storytelling and also telling us the story of Mr. Lena Man and the Jumbidam. To you, our guests, thank you for joining us every week on Authored by Us. We look forward to you joining us next week as we introduce a new author and their book. Until then, happy reading.
All right. Bye-bye.
Take care.
I
Thank
said
you.
something that wasn't true. I said something that wasn't true. I said something that wasn't true. Now I'm sorry for what I do. Now I'm sorry for what I do. I said something that wasn't true. I said something that wasn't true. I said something that wasn't true. Now I'm sorry for what I do. Now I'm sorry for what I do.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Authored by Us. Every author has a story to tell, and we enjoy bringing their stories to you each week. Whether you are listening as a young reader or are sharing this podcast with the young readers in your life, we are delighted to celebrate these stories inspired by diversity and shared in the voice